Okay. The Aztecs are a Mesoamerican culture, sharing a great deal with the cultures in Mesoamerica in this region that came before them. They are going to flourish in the time period roughly 1300 to 1521, and that's the end date when Cortez will capture the place we know as Mexico City today. They are located in central Mexico. The Aztecs did include different ethnic groups, all sharing a single language, the single language, Nahuatl. We'll see that written in a minute. They were organized into city-states. Some of these city-states formed alliances, and that does include the Aztec Empire, which was created out of a confederation of 3 separate city-states forming what we call the Triple Alliance. For our purposes, probably the most important of these city-states is the Mexica, located in Tenochtitlan, which is the Nahuatl name for what we know today as Mexico City. The term Aztec that we continue to use is something of a controversial term because it was applied first by a European in the 19th century. Again, an outsider defining the nature of the people who live in the New World. But it also has been maintained as a useful term. If we're talking, that term itself, the Aztec, may indeed apply just to the Mexica, the people around Tenochtitlan, the area of Mexico City. It may also be used to describe all of the pre-Hispanic people located in central Mexico. The slides that we're looking at now help to show us a little bit of what it was like when Cortez arrived. The slide in the upper right is a reconstructed drawing of some of the chinampas, the floating gardens. When the Spanish arrive and describe present-day Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, they describe it as an incredibly splendid capital that is sustained by floating islands. These floating islands were places where the Aztecs could engage in agriculture, giving the people all of the food that they needed, and also reserving some of these floating islands just for the cultivation of flowers, because to the ancient Aztecs, flowers were highly appreciated and very important within the culture. The slide in the upper left is a depiction of the now destroyed Temple Mayor, or the major temple, within the sacred precinct, the special compound essentially, at the heart of the city of Tenochtitlan. It was believed, and if you go to the center double pyramid right here, it was believed that that was the axis mundi, linking all of the levels of the universe together at the very, very heart of the Aztec realm and in the most sacred precinct of the Aztec Empire. All of this was destroyed by Cortez in 1521 after the city was under siege for about three full months. The Aztecs withstood the assaults of the siege by the Spanish before falling. What Cortez's men then did was to fill in most of the canals, that includes the chinampas, and to destroy most of the buildings, certainly any temples that would have been associated with a pagan faith, or any buildings that would have been associated with the Aztec rulers. So the buildings were burned, they were toppled. The stones that were left from those structures were reused, repurposed, we would probably say today, to construct a new capital. Consequently, in Mexico City today, underneath the surface of the modern city lays the remains of the ancient capital of the Aztecs. And from time to time, as construction is done, or as work is done on water lines or underground structures, subways, for example, any work that is done that reveals what is under the surface often exposes archaeological finds that can become an important link, to the realm of the Aztecs. Okay. This is another slide that will show us the floating gardens, the complexity, I guess, of the floating gardens. The Aztecs in the upper left had to stake an area below the level of the water so that it could be filled with soil that would be maintained, and then they could use that for farming. I'd like to suggest that they were skilled, incredibly skilled, at water management, city planning, engineering, and these also were beautiful designs. So I think the aesthetic abilities of the Aztecs also come through in the beauty of the floating gardens that they produced and left behind. On the lower right portion of the screen, you can see one of the floating gardens that is working today. So the tradition has been, I'm going to say, restored. Sometimes the canals and the floating gardens, the chinapas, have actually been rebuilt. Some of them actually continued from the period of the Aztecs. So the tradition is, I think, a continuing one, but also perhaps an important one, because the people of Mexico do in fact know that it has a very revered past, associating it with the success, the achievements of the Aztec and their empire. For those of you who would actually like to pronounce some of these words, I have given you some basic pronunciation tips, I guess you could say, in the lower portion, the lower left portion of the slide. I have to admit that Aztec names in particular, especially the names of gods and goddesses, are among the worst names in the entire planet to pronounce, and they are incredibly long. This might at least give you a little bit of a tip on how to get through some of the basic words. Okay, the capital of the ancient Aztecs and Mexico City today is given at the top, and you can pronounce it Tenochtitlan. The people, the Aztec in that city, their name Mexica, and the reason it's Mexica, that's based upon Nahuatl language, is that the X in Nahuatl is generally pronounced as an S, and that should help you a great deal as you look at some of these Aztec terms. Nahuatl is that's the pronunciation. For the language of the Aztecs, it is still a living language. It's not a dead language. And the reason I tell you that is so that you know, indeed, any language that's living is changing. So I can't guarantee you 100% that the way we pronounce these words today is exactly the way that the Aztecs pronounced them. But I'm going to guess that it's reasonably close. Okay. Between the 13th and the 16th centuries, a series of nomadic tribesmen will arrive and contest, really, for the area of central Mexico. One of these groups will be the Aztecs. The point I would like to make is that they ultimately will take land by force and create a conquest state. That is important to know, because if the Aztecs had done it a different way, perhaps they would not have been beaten by Cortez when he arrives. Cortez, with I think it's 550 men, a few horses, and some gunpowder, was able to vanquish the Aztecs because of the way they treated the people they conquered, something that we'll return to at a later date. But it is because of the nature of the founding of the Aztec Empire that Cortez was actually able to turn it against the Aztecs, creating their own downfall. We are looking right now at a page on the left from the Codex Mendoza that helps to record the Aztec view of history. Once they create their empire, they do what a lot of cultures have done, and that is to write their own history and write their own mythology, or at least create it and pass it on by oral tradition. According to tradition, among the Aztecs, in the 14th century, they were guided as a people, and remember they're this group of nomadic people, wandering looking for a home. They are guided by the war god, which is their god associated with war and with the sun. His name is Huitzilopochtli. That's one of those Aztec names that is scary. You'll see it written down later. He directs them, their ancestors essentially, to look for an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus attached to a stone. And when they have this vision, that is the exact location where they should settle. According to this legend, the Aztecs see this in Lake Texcoco, and this becomes essentially the home of the Aztecs and the area of the Aztec Empire focused upon present-day Mexico City. Let me say something about the origin for this particular codex or book. It was created for the Viceroy of New Spain, in other words, the ruler here in the New World representing Spain. His name was Antonio de Mendoza, and he had it made using local artisans to create this, people who had knowledge of our Aztec ideas and traditions and history. Why did he do this? Was he trying to be a benevolent person to record their history? No, he wanted to create a record he could use for taxation. And that is included, in fact, in the manuscript, and I'll show you a page of that later. This particular book was then sent from the New World to the Old One by ship. It was supposed to go back to Spain, but it was intercepted by French pirates. The French pirates took the book. We don't know what they did with it exactly, but they did apparently pass it on, and in the 19th century, it reemerged in an library in Britain, in England. The Brits have been very generous in sharing the book with the rest of the world, and it has given us a fairly good idea of many of the beliefs, the traditions, and I'm going to say the orchestrated history of the Aztecs. Okay, if you take a look at the page, and it's the frontispiece, and I do want to point that out. That means it's the very, very beginning to this book about the Aztecs. It was created by Aztecs themselves, or essentially the descendants of the Aztecs who ruled for the Spanish. And in the center we see an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus with the stone. So it is a reference to essentially founding of the Aztec Empire. It literally is X marks the spot, but it's also the intersection of 4 separate canals, I think referencing the design that is a part of the Aztec Empire and the notion of 4 directions and 4 quarters, 4 divisions within the Aztec world. It also is an image that shows around our eagle, a series of, let me just try a bigger detail here. Okay, a little bit easier to see. You can see a series of people on mats, seated. This may indeed, we aren't sure, but this may indeed be a reference to the subject city-states of the Aztecs. These would be the individual city-states under the control of the Aztecs and the individual city-states who have to pay tribute to the Aztecs. Underneath the eagle, the cactus, and that rock, there is a shield, and that is an Aztec shield with a weapon bundle. If you go down below, in this region right in here, you're going to find 2 Aztec warriors defeating the enemies of the Aztecs, presumably with the intention of adding more city-states to the Aztec Empire. It was an empire of conquest, and it was always necessary to keep expanding the empire to provide for the needs, essentially, of the Aztec people, particularly for the needs of sacrificial victims. Okay, in the background, you will be able to see, and here's one of them, here is the other. Those are pyramids that are collapsing and being burned by the Aztecs. So what the Aztecs are doing is conquering these city-states and destroying the foundations of the city-states. The Aztecs are shown in hierarchic scale. They're larger than the soldiers that they are conquering. The Aztecs did not have true writing. They had picture writing, and they followed a series of conventions in drawn imagery that would be readily understood by the viewer. There are no manuscripts that survived from the time of the Aztecs. We do believe that they existed and were destroyed by the Spanish because these were documents associated with a pagan religion or with a heathen faith. Everything that we have that comes from the Aztec world is in fact done under the Spanish to record, for one reason or another, the traditions or the history of the Aztec people, but generally with the idea of taking advantage of the infrastructure that the Aztecs have already created. Before leaving this, I would like to go back to make the comment that this image from the Codex Mendoza is an image that decorates the Mexican flag and also has appeared on Mexican coins. And you might be wondering why that would be. We in the United States don't have anything like that in reference to the indigenous people or the natives who were here at conquest. The reason for this is in Mexico, there is a great sense of pride in relation to the past, to prehistoric, not prehistoric, excuse me, pre-Columbian, before the European arrival, pre-conquest Mexico. And in particular, there's a great sense of respect for the Aztecs. Why is that? In part because the modern Mexican people are descendants from the Aztecs. The statistics that I have read approximately around 62%, that's well over half of the population, is mestizo. That means a mixture of native and outside or European blood. There is still about 21% indigenous, mostly, a little bit of a mix, and 7% that is fully indigenous. The remaining 10% would be largely European in ancestry. The point I'm trying to make is that the people of Mexico today are indeed related to the ancient people of Mexico, the pre-Columbian people of Mexico, and because of that, they have a great sense of pride in the creations of their ancestors.